Good evening. My name is Roy Thurley and I am chairman of the local Holocaust Memorial Committee here in Llandudno, North Wales. Very warm welcome to all who have joined us from so many different places. Several of our local politicians and civic leaders are joining with us this evening, for which we are very grateful. It is so important that the Holocaust is remembered so that it is not repeated. I need to mention to you that audio and video recording is being done. If you do not wish to be seen, please stop video on your device. Our aim is to bring to you a meaningful commemoration, despite not being able to be together in person. We had planned a live event at Cregidon Community Centre here in Llandudno, until the Welsh Government introduced new public control regulations which made it not possible for us to hold an in-person meeting. That was 1 month ago, so since then we have been working hard to produce this online event. As is customary, we will begin by lighting 6 memorial candles. We invite you to participate in this if you wish by lighting your own memorial candle, as we screen the lighting of 6 candles to remember that over 6 million Jewish people perished in the Shoah. Please take care as you light your candle. "2022 marks the 80th anniversary of Hitler's decision to implement the final solution of the Jewish question. The aim was to eradicate all the Jews from Europe, whether by deportation or extermination. So this conference was called to sort out the mechanics of how it was going to be done. On 20th January 1942, 15 men met at a large house in Wannsee, a suburb of Berlin, in order to organize the extermination of Europe's Jewish people in the most efficient way. The meeting was chaired by Reinhard Heydrich. The men at the table did not even mention whether such a plan should be undertaken, but instead discussed the implementation of a policy decision that had already been made at the highest level of the Nazi regime. The number of Jews under discussion numbered over 11 million. including those from countries not yet captured by Nazi Germany. So within that figure are 300,000 from Britain, though the protocol of the meeting refers to the country as England. The meeting took less than 2 hours to agree the extermination plan, and the participants finished with a glass of cognac. The plan was duly implemented, and more than 6 million Jewish people lost their lives as a result. This was anti-Semitism at its very worst. Regrettably, anti-Semitism did not die out with the Nazi regime. Today, this deadly virus is increasing and spreading. The Community Security Trust's report on the first half of 2021 showed that there was a record number of anti-Semitic incidents in the UK, with a monthly total of 639 in May alone. That was the month in which Israel was attacked by Hamas from the Gaza Strip. Although Hamas has now been banned in the UK, for which we are very grateful, its genocidal ideology, regrettably, is still flourishing. Just in the last few weeks, the renowned Simon Wiesenthal Centre produced its annual report on the top 10 countries and institutions worldwide with the worst record for anti-Semitism. The Centre is a Jewish global human rights organisation researching the Holocaust and hate in a historic and contemporary context. Simon Wiesenthal, a survivor of the Nazi death camps, dedicated his life to documenting the crimes of the Holocaust and to hunting down the perpetrators still at large. When history looks back, Wiesenthal explained, I want people to know the Nazis weren't able to kill millions of people and get away with it. His work stands as a reminder and a warning for future generations. On 28th of December, the Centre released their 2021 Global Top 10 for anti-Semitism. In top spot was Iran, with Hamas coming second. No surprises there. In number 3 spot was the UK, and specifically the BBC. We are the 3rd worst country in the world for anti-Semitism, largely thanks to the BBC. Regrettably, I am not really surprised. A recent example of BBC bias was on Hanukkah, when a group of Muslims attacked a bus filled with Jews in the centre of London. The BBC falsely reported that anti-Muslim slurs could be heard from within the bus, deftly turning the victims into victimisers. Subsequently, the BBC has been accused of breaking the law in its reporting of the incident and is being investigated by Ofcom. It is now 18 years since the BBC commissioned the Bladen report on the BBC's treatment of Israel, and it has still never been released to the public. At one point, the BBC spent £200,000 of our money as licence payers to defend their decision in court. Let us hope and pray that the current legal action against the BBC will succeed and see heads roll at Broadcasting House. We must never forget our history, but always learn from it. We are now going to have a musical interlude from Chris and Kate Dean. I want to thank Chris here publicly for provoking me into organising a Zoom event after the live event had to be cancelled. Like me, he was gutted that there was to be no public event, so he encouraged us to go online. They have recorded this piece specifically for us this evening. It is a beautiful rendering of Psalm 32, You Are My Hiding Place. At the end of that piece, they will sing the Welsh national anthem. in recognition that this evening is coming to you from Llandudno in the middle of the North Wales coast. An English translation will be shown for those of us who don't know the Welsh language.
Trust in you. Let the weak say, I am strong in the strength of my God. You are my hiding place. You always fill my heart with songs of deliverance. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. I will trust in you. Let the weak say, I am strong in the strength of my God. My hiding place, you always fill my heart with songs of deliverance. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you.
Thank you very much, Chris and Kate, for that lovely singing there and playing. We will come back to them later when we sing together the 23rd Psalm. We are now going to have an address by Rabbi Amir Elituv from Sha'ari Chaim in South Manchester. I still remember his very powerful message to us a couple of years ago when he described how anti-Semitism is affecting his community. His subject on this occasion is rabbinical response post the Holocaust. Rabbi Amir.
Thank you, Roy, and all your team for organizing this evening. And as a congregation, we are proud and honored to be associated and to take part in this special event. I dedicate this talk in memory of my great-grandparents, Yakov and Ida Rosenzweig, who were fortunate to escape Germany in 1933, together with my then 3-year-old grandmother, Mira Sandler. I also dedicate it to their very large, wider family, none of whom left Germany and none of them survived. As a rabbi of a congregation, whenever reading and studying this topic, I always say to myself, what would I have done had I been in the very shoes of the rabbis during the Holocaust period? It is a question that is nearly impossible to answer, but allow me to chart in the next few minutes what was the rabbinic response during this period. In the pre-Holocaust period, Jewry in Europe were racked over the religious response to Zionism and also the shift of many Jews moving away from religious practice. There were huge disagreements to whether religious Jewry supports Zionism, and similarly in the beginning of the 20th century, many rabbis were very concerned about what God had in store for them over the lack of religious observance amongst an extremely high proportion of Jews. Many religious rabbis viewed secular Zionism as an impending threat over the destruction of Jewry, and on the other hand, there were many rabbis who viewed that the anti-Zionism was a source of destruction of the Jews. By 1938 and 1939, great European rabbis who traveled from Poland to the USA and Palestine knew of the impending threat and the dark atmosphere that was hanging over Europe. And the communities tried to persuade the leading rabbis of Lithuanian and Polish Jewry to stay away from Europe and not go back to their homes. The rabbi of Ger, one of the Poland's largest Hasidic communities, bade farewell to his group of followers in Palestine and told them he cannot leave his family and community behind in Europe. During the war, the rabbinic response varied. There were different leaders of towns and Hasidic sects who were urged by their followers, both in Europe and abroad in America, to escape the furnace and flee outside Europe. Some did, and others remained. Those who fled escaped with a heavy heart, but also charged with a mission to rebuild what they had lost. When reading about those spiritual giants who left, you can sense that they knew what was about to happen, and their miraculous escape is one that many books have been written. The stories of the escape of the Bobover rabbi, the rabbi of Ger, the Belzer rabbi are gripping. They survived, but many of their families were totally destroyed. But they were amongst the leading lights charged with the rebuilding of their communities that were nearly totally wiped out. Amongst the rabbis that stayed, despite having the option of escaping, were the Satmar rabbi, the Klausenberger rabbi, and the Bluzhever rabbi. Each one have stories of open miracles that occurred to them during their survival in the concentration camps, and how they inspired their fellow inmates to survive and have trust in God. An inspirational response comes in the form of rabbinic writings that had survived the war, written during the Holocaust. The Piacenza rabbi was one of the leading rabbis in Warsaw. He led his people and wrote during his time in the Warsaw Ghetto. His focus as was that of many rabbis during the Holocaust, was how can we strengthen our belief in God? How can we improve ourselves? How can we ensure our children keep their Jewish identity? All at the same time, while still defending themselves physically, getting food to survive, and establishing a whole new community. His writings were found by a construction worker in a large milk canister after the war. Here is his book. The collation of the rabbinic actions during the war has been a source of comfort and inspiration in how to lead a community in impossible times. Outside Europe, the rabbinic response during the war was one of demonstrations, especially in America, lobbying the Congress to allow money raised to be transferred to Germany, to allow Jews in Hungary to be freed on the Kastner trains. But that fell on deaf ears. There was a large yeshiva, a Talmudic college, called Mir Yeshiva in Eastern Europe, who managed to get visas, and hundreds of pupils and their rabbinic teachers went on trains across Russia, then into Kobe, Japan, and finally to Shanghai. For the duration of the war, they set up their Mir Yeshiva in Shanghai and studied Torah, the Jewish law, with an intensity, with a drive, knowing that their study hall may be the only one from Europe standing and surviving. They felt the weight of the Torah on their shoulders. After the war, the rabbinic response changed. On the one hand, they had to provide services and meet the religious needs of the survivors, which was extremely challenging. The Israeli chief rabbi, Rabbi Isaac Herzog, of whom the current president of Israel is named after, had a mission of finding the lost Jewish children who were deposited by their parents for safekeeping in the Christian monasteries and nunneries. And many of those children were not told of their true identity or reunited with their surviving families. He met with Pope Pius to ask for his help to locate thousands of children. But again, his pleas fell on deaf ears. Throughout the religious rabbinate, the issue of why the Holocaust occurred was too painful to tackle, too soon to deal with. The challenge was, what do we do now? How do we respond? Do we focus on remembering? Do we focus on educating about what happened? Or do we focus on rebuilding what was lost? The vast majority of religious Jews focused on the latter, to rebuild what was lost, to try and recreate the former glorious communities of Eastern Europe, all at the same time, whilst licking their own wounds and trying to come to terms with their own heavy personal losses. The rabbi of Sanz-Klausenberg rebuilt his community in Netanya and built the famous Llandudno Hospital. In 1980, he said the following in the groundbreaking ceremony of the second hospital building: "I was saved from the gas chambers, saved from Hitler. I spent several years in Nazi death camps. Besides the fact that they murdered my wife and 11 children, my mother, my sisters, and my brother, of my whole family, some 150 people, I was the only one who survived. I witnessed their cruelty. I remember as if it were today how they shot me in the arm. I was afraid to go to the Nazi infirmary. Though there were doctors there, I knew that if I went in, I'd never come out alive." Despite my fear of the Nazis, I plucked a leaf from a tree and stuck it to my wound to staunch the bleeding. Then I cut a branch and tied it around the wound to hold it in place. With God's help, it healed in 3 days. Then I promised myself that if with God's help I got well and got out of there, away from those Rashaim, those wicked people, I will build a hospital in Israel where every human being would be cared for with dignity. And the basis of that hospital would be that the doctors and nurses would believe that there is a God in this world, and that when they treat a patient, they are fulfilling the greatest commandment in the Torah. The rabbis that survived, those that went through the camps, and those that escaped, each focused on rebuilding. Today, every one of those communities numbers in the tens of thousands, and some even surpass 100,000, when only after the Holocaust, maybe tens of them were around. How did the rabbis remember the Holocaust? Within the day of national mourning of the destruction of the 2 temples on the 9th of Av, certain lamentations were composed and recited. Many of the religious did not wish to mark Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, as it fell on the celebratory Hebrew month of Nisan. However, this attitude has changed, and everyone marks that day. Within the religious community, the writings of the Holocaust didn't feature greatly. It was too painful, too soon. Historical writings of the Holocaust mainly featured non-religious historians. However, in the last 20 years, there has been a huge shift where many rabbis and religious historians have focused on the religious perspective on what occurred, and that perspective has often been missing in the historical narrative. The attitude by the rabbis on the non-religious Jews has changed massively because of the Holocaust. Certain rulings that were strict before the Holocaust days had been made more lenient because rabbis understand the huge challenge that the Holocaust has on people's faith in God, and are more understanding why some Jews may be non-religious. As a rabbi, I have been inspired by Rabbi Lau's book called Out of the Depths, one that both challenges you and inspires you to understand as a Jew, we are but a link in the long chain of history. That chain has been tested for centuries, but we have to hold onto that chain. We have to inspire and know that our role is not to allow that chain to break. It had been done for centuries before us, and it is our duty to make sure it carries on for centuries ahead. Thank you very much. A copy of this talk, whoever would like the actual text of this talk, will be made available. If you email Roy Thurley, he'll be more than happy to send you a copy of this talk. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi, for that fascinating account, most of which was entirely new to me. Just little odd things that I'd have read before, but that was absolutely fascinating. I learned so much from it, and I look forward to receiving your notes so that I can read through them again myself. We are now going to join together in singing Psalm 23, and the words of the hymn will be up on the screen, so we'll go over to Chris to play for us.
shepherd I'll not want. He makes me down to lie in pastures green. He leadeth me the quiet waters by. My soul he doth restore again, and me to walk doth make within the paths of righteousness, in for his own name's sake. Yea, though I walk in death's dark vale, yet will I fear no ill, for thou art with me, and thy rod and staff me comfort still. My table thou hast furnished in presence of my foes. My head thou dost with oil anoint, and my cup overflows. Goodness and mercy all my life shall surely follow me. Within God's house forevermore, my dwelling place shall be.
In the last year, we have been introduced to the Northern Holocaust Education Group, based in the Manchester area. Their mission is to encourage Holocaust survivors, their children and their grandchildren to share their stories so that others, particularly those in school, can hear real stories about what happened back in the 1940s. I do want to thank Ernie Hunter, who runs the group, for his assistance in our commemorations this year. Not only did the group provide us with a Holocaust survivor as our guest speaker, they have also provided 2 second-generation survivors who between them will be addressing all 8 high schools in this area of North Wales with live online sessions. A second-generation survivor, Mrs. Judith Heyman, will be speaking to Ysgol John Bright students on Friday, and will be speaking to Ysgol Aberconwy and St David's College students tomorrow, and both Erius and Brunelian students on Tuesday. I watched her presentation to students at Ysgol John Bright on Friday, and I have to say it was very good indeed and generated a number of excellent questions from the pupils present. Ernie Hunter will be speaking to Ysgol Craydon students tomorrow and Dyffryn Conwy students on Tuesday. He will also be speaking to Rydal Penrose students the following Tuesday. We are delighted that all 8 high schools are taking part in this programme, where they are not only able to hear the live testimony of a second-generation survivor, but also ask questions of them. And I want to thank Sian Asbridge, a member of our local committee, for all the work she has done in drawing the school's programme together. We are now going to hear the testimony of a Holocaust survivor from Hungary, Tommy Comely, BEM, whom I had the privilege of meeting late last year at his home. Regrettably, he is unable to be with us as a Zoom participant, as he has been instructed by his doctor to rest his voice for a month. but we do have his story on video, which we shall now see. So this is Tommy Connolly's story.
Before I start telling you about what happened to me during the Holocaust, let me just say a very few words about myself. I was born in Budapest in Hungary in 1936, and my father came from a Zionist Hungarian family. We weren't particularly religious. I was going to a Jewish school for about a year and a half before things got really bad. And I will tell you the actual story in a second. But maybe just underlying the facts that are to come. I myself was lucky enough not to end up in a concentration camp, but the events were really the after effect of the events carried on with me, mostly in the way that for decades I would not even admit to anybody that I was Jewish. And that carried on in Hungary. When I was 20, there was an uprising against the then communist regime in Hungary, which created such an upheaval that about 200,000 people left the country, and I was one of those. I was lucky enough to be given a scholarship, and I came and studied in Britain, where I qualified as an engineer and set up set up my family. I married an English girl from Leeds, and that's really what brought me to the present moment. But to get back to my story, let me say a few words about Hungary. Hungary had a very long history of anti-Semitism through the centuries, and that kind of made itself felt as the Second World War unfolded. Germany attacked Poland and Slovakia, and a lot of Jewish people who had seen what was going on in Germany decided to escape from there, and they came to Hungary in very large numbers. And altogether, with the refugees, the Hungarian Jewish community grew to about 1 million people. And by this time, the Hungarian government decided to join the Germans in the war effort, and they're also following the German example. And very soon they brought in some anti-Jewish laws, and in 1939 they restricted Jews in various professions, civil service and all the rest of it. And by 1942 there was a total exclusion, mostly aimed at the fact that Jewish people have always laid a great emphasis on education, and as a result of that, in many of the professions, arts, even in some parts of government and civil service, they reached a very, very significant proportion of those places, and that obviously generated quite a lot of jealousy. And when these restrictions came into being, my father, who ran a very small business, a scrap metal business, he was forced to sell it to his foreman, and he became one of some 200,000 who became jobless in effect, and he had to learn a new trade. He started making small ceramics just to give us a living. As the war went on, the particularly in the Eastern Front, the Germans were suffering significant losses, and they asked the Hungarian government to send people to the front. And when it came to the Jews, the Hungarians were not willing to give them arms. So they created what they called forced labor units. And my father was one of those people who got called up. And when I was about 7, he left home. And with this single exception later on that I will tell you, that was about the last time that I saw him. The Hungarian government, as the war unfolded further, were afraid that they would end up on the losing side, and tried to contact the British to come to a separate treaty to change sides, in fact. And when Hitler found out about this, he sent the German troops into Hungary, and with it came a small contingent of the Gestapo to introduce all the severe activities and constraints at this point, which they had practiced in other countries. This was in March of 1944, and the first serious anti-Jewish law that came into being was that all of us from age 6 upwards had to wear a yellow star on our outer garments. And what I personally remember from this is that as more and more such laws came into being, the government used placards on the streets to bring it to the notice of everybody what decisions they were making. And the word Jew, which is Žido in Hungarian, kept popping up left, right, and center. And I really had this kind of oppressive feeling that everybody was pointing fingers at me, and that really was a contributing factor to my being actually ashamed of being Jewish. After the Yellow Star, the government also constrained the use of public transport. They confiscated a lot of Jewish property, most importantly radios and telephones, because they wanted to make sure that we were out of communication. And they also introduced rationing. That was for everybody, but for Jewish people, these rations were much smaller than for anybody else. And of course, that affected our everyday living in a particular way. And following again the fascist tactics in Poland and other countries, they decided to deport as much of the Hungarian Jewish population, particularly to Auschwitz, as they could. And they started in the provinces, and by it started in April, and by the end of June, something like 500,000 to 600,000 provincial Jews had been put into cattle wagons, and you can imagine the conditions as they suffered for 2 or 3 days on the way to the camps. And quite a lot of people who hear about the Holocaust come across the figure of 6 million being deported overall. What they don't realize is that out of that 6 million, 1.5 million were children. And they had to suffer exactly the same conditions and all the deprivations as the adults, and they probably suffered even more because they didn't understand what was going on. For that matter, even the adults have been misled into believing that they were just being taken to work camps and the like, because I mentioned before, through education, they had filled all these important positions in the country's life, and they really couldn't believe that all that will be overlooked, and they went almost willingly, and they didn't put up any resistance. They couldn't contemplate the danger that was facing them, because even when they received news from various quarters. Going on to June 1944, the government decided that in Budapest, where the remaining Jewish population was, they wanted to concentrate the population, and they nominated about 2,000 apartment buildings for Jewish occupation, giving each of us about 5 square meters of space. And that meant really a very, very tight living conditions. We were to some extent lucky that an aunt and great aunt of mine were living together in a one-bedroom flat, and my mother and I could go and join them in that space. So we had one bedroom and bathroom and kitchen to the 4 of us. It was tight, but at least we weren't like some other people who had to go in and move and live with total strangers. The government also introduced constraints on shopping. Jews couldn't shop in Christian shops and vice versa. There was a general attempt, as we had moved into these yellow star houses, to grab Jewish property, both the buildings and the contents, and it was pretty miserable living. We were under curfew. We could only go out for 3 hours a day, and you can imagine if under those conditions you were unlucky enough not to have a doctor or a dentist in your house, you virtually you were left with no medical attention in 3 hours. You couldn't possibly go to a hospital for anything like that. And from this period, one of the saddest event that I can tell you about is that what we thought was a good break, my father managed to get a 3-day leave from his commanding officer, and he came home to stay with us, and it was great joy. But in every one of these apartment blocks, there was a concierge whose duty it was to check on the people who were in the building, and he was very concerned that we were exceeding the numbers. And he went and reported my father to what was now emerging as really the controlling force over and above the government, the Hungarian Fascist Party, what they called the Arrow Cross. And these people came round, notwithstanding my father's permit, they took him away. And I never saw him again. All I know is that by this time, because the Arrow Cross were not satisfied with the speed of deportations through the trains, what they used to do is that they would go and round up 100-300 people, march them to the River Danube, which goes through the middle of Budapest, and they would tie together 3 people, and after they stripped them naked, and take them to the riverside, shoot the one in the middle who would fall in the river, dragging the other two with them. And sadly, I have to assume that that is exactly what happened to my father. And I was always wondering who these people were, who from one day to the next, from civilized and normal individuals suddenly became like wild beasts. I could never understand it then, and I can't understand it now. The war moved toward Budapest ever more rapidly, and the Russians were approaching from the east. This was in the autumn. The Allied troops landed by then in Normandy, which strangely enough we managed to find out about, because when we had the air raids, the British would be bombing at night, the Americans during the day, and we, during the air raids, would go into the basements of these buildings. But somebody managed to hide a radio set, and we would listen to the BBC's and Voice America's Hungarian language broadcasts. And so we were hoping that this would eventually bring us relief. It's a very strange feeling when you're being bombed and your life is in danger, and at the same time listening to the adult conversation as a child, you realize that the good guys are the ones who are in fact trying to kill you. But we lived on, more and more trouble under these circumstances, until my mother found out that they were now setting up a ghetto in a 1 square mile area of Budapest. And this really appeared as a serious threat to her. And not to mention the fact that they were starving and disease of all sorts in the ghetto. She also knew that that was the last step before deportations. So she made every effort to get us away from that possibility. And in fact, found out from an uncle of mine who was one of the Zionist leaders in the Jewish community, that some of the neutral embassies, the Swedes, the Swiss, the Spanish, had purchased some property where they put up their national emblems and flags, etc., and said this is protected property, and they offered it to those Jews who managed to contact them. And my mother found a place through my uncle's friends, and we moved in to a 3 or 4 bedroom villa. Just imagine about 30, 40 of us in one place with 1 bathroom, 1 bedroom, very limited food, etc. And we were hoping that we would manage to survive there. And in the meantime, it's probably worth mentioning that the only kind of resistance that emerged at that point, that there were some young Zionists with my uncle who managed to produce some false documents showing that you were a citizen of another country, or that you were protected by the Red Cross and stuff like that. There were some notable people like Raoul Wallenberg and Karl Lutz who really led this kind of activity. But apart from that, there was no chance for any other resistance. And the other very significant fact that I can't even say I remember it, because it was my mother who told me about it well after the war in the 1960s. She obviously couldn't bring herself to mention it, that during this time she was rounded up on the street one day, and the Arrow Cross started marching her with a couple of hundred other women. By this time, there were hardly other men around the place. And it occurred to her that if she was taken away maybe on the deportation trains to a camp or something like that, not only was her life at risk, but also I was left in that house with a bunch of total strangers, no friend, no relative, and probably I would perish too. So, although there were 4 armed guards, she decided to make a run for it. And the guards tried to shoot her, and fortunately these were untrained people, they kept missing. But what she told me in her story was that as she turned around to see what was going on behind her, to her utter amazement, she found that not one of the other 200 followed her example. Probably a half or 2/3 could have got away. But by this time, people were so much in the mental condition of just wanting to survive that nobody would want to take a risk. It was kind of as long as there's life, there is hope. So they were just frozen and wouldn't do anything even to save their life or get their liberty again. We managed to stay for another few weeks in this so-called protected house. And again, my mother began to sense that the Arrow Cross and the Germans may not respect the neutral flag very, very much longer. And through her father, she found out that Lutheran family, friends of my grandfather, might be prepared to hide us. And actually on Christmas Eve, she said to me, "We're leaving this place, pack a small bag for herself, and I got a little backpack with the absolute minimal belongings." And she took the yellow star off our overcoats, got on a tram. She told me in advance, if anybody stops us, we must not say we're Jewish, we're just going to join family for Christmas Eve celebrations. Unfortunately, nobody stopped us, and we got to the place where we had the address. They were total strangers to us, but they very kindly hid us in their cellar. We would only be allowed to come up in the evenings with the shutters closed on the windows, because they were afraid of their own neighbors reporting on us. And we were on the side of town, again, very fortunately, from which the Russians were approaching. And by the second week of January, we were actually liberated. And we could hear the gunfire. We knew there were street fightings in the rest of the town. And eventually the news came that there were no more German troops in Hungary, and it was possibly safe to go back to our home. And my mother was very keen to find out what happened to the rest of the family. We had to walk. There was no transport. We had to walk to the river, because we were on one side of the Danube and our home on the other side. When we got there, we found that all the bridges had been blown up by the Germans, but we managed to get across in a small boat. And when we met in particular, my grandmother, we then began to get the news about events in the family. And it turned out that of my mother's family, something like 2/3 perished. In fact, no man was left alive. And of my father's siblings, he was one of 6. There were only 2 who survived. And really, this is more or less the end of the story. We would go almost every day, my mother and I, to the central synagogue, which became a kind of gathering place for Jewish people looking for news about survivors. And some people would come back from the camps or from the labor units and just stick up a notice saying who they have seen dead or alive. And eventually we just had to conclude. My mother kept hoping that perhaps somebody would bring news about my father, but it just never happened. And we just had to accept that. And that's how my story ends.
Let's just pause for a few moments to consider what we have just heard. We move on now to a solemn commemoration of the Holocaust, which will be led for us by Cantor Michael Isdale from the Bowden Synagogue. He will begin by singing the song Eli, Eli, which means, my God, my God. He will then sing El Malei Rachamim. This is a prayer which originated in the Jewish communities of Western and Eastern Europe, and since the end of the Holocaust has been adapted as a memorial prayer for the victims of the Holocaust and Nazi persecution. An English translation will be on the screen. This will be followed by the Kaddish, a mourner's prayer that praises God and expresses a yearning for the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. This will be spoken by Rabbi Amir. Now, over to Michael Isdale.
Thank you very much, Roy. Good evening, everybody. The piece I'm going to start to sing, as Roy said, is a piece called Eli Eli, which means my Lord, my Lord. These are words written by King David in his book of Psalms. The song itself is dedicated to a Hungarian Jewess who in the Second World War was a special operations executive and was instrumental in rescuing Hungarian Jews about to be deported to Auschwitz. Captured, imprisoned, tortured, she refused to reveal details of her mission. She was executed by firing squad and became a national heroine. Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer leolam, achor v'hayam, rishrus shel hamayim, barak hashamayim, tfilat Adam, achor v'hayam, rishrus shel hamayim, barak hashamayim, tfilat Adam. Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer leolam, achor v'hayam, rishrus shel hamayim, barak now the memorial prayer. שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה, במלאכות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר רקיע, מהירים ומזהירים, את נשמת הקדושים והטהורים, שהומסו ושנהרגו ושנשחטו ושנשרפו ושנטבעו ושנחנכו על קידוש השם, באושוויץ, ברגן-בלזן, בוכנוואלד, טרבלינקה-מיידנק, ובכל שהמחנות השמדה, בהבון שאנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמותיהם בגן עדן, תהי מנוחתם לכם ולרחמים, יסירם וזיתגן בבלי עלמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני ונחלו וסום, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר אמן.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותה וימיך מלכותה, ויצמח ברוקנה ויקרב משיחה. בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהא שמי רבה מברך לעלם ולעלמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה, שירתה, תשבחתה ונחמתה. דאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהא שלמה רבה מן שמיה, חיים ושבע וישועה ונחמה, ושזבה ורפואה וגאולה וסליחה וכפרה, ורווח והצלה לנו ולכל עמו ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו וברחמיו, יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
Richard Simon, chairman of Sha'arei Hayim Synagogue, will now say a few words.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Roy, for your introduction. Before I thank those many people who have made this evening such a success, I'd like to tell you of my connection with the evening. Way back in 2004, I was working for Magen David Adom, Israel's Red Cross organization, as its UK regional director, was based in Mamlock House in Manchester. During one of the Lebanon conflicts, we were running an appeal, and one day there was a knock on my door, and in walked Peter McGowan and Barry Robinson, two Christian gentlemen. They asked if we'd take a donation from them, as they were great Christian supporters of Israel. Later, they told me there were many Christian people supporting Israel. And to cut a long story short, we went on to establish Christian Friends of Magen David Adom, which is still effective today, and during which I made many friends, and I believe met Roy Thurley on one occasion through the Christian Friends of Israel. My other link with this evening is that my late father left Germany in 1935 because of what he could see was going on, and he came to the UK with his two brothers. Fortunately, we didn't lose family during the Holocaust. However, my father was well aware of many families who didn't survive. This evening has been a remarkable tribute in many different ways to remind us that we should never forget what happened in the Holocaust, that we should educate our children and grandchildren so they're aware of the dangers and do everything they can to prevent it happening again. I hope you all bear with me, as there's so many people who've given of their time and support to make this evening a success. Chris and Kate Dean started the evening by giving a musical theme to it and to put us in the mood for the rest of the evening. Rabbi Amir, who just happens to be my rabbi, then gave us some serious, informative and inspiring words for which we thank you. He was followed by a beautiful and lyrical rendition of The Lord is My Shepherd, Psalm 23, which Chris and Kate Dean led the singing. That led into a talk, a most moving talk by Tommy Komoli, talking about his experiences in Hungary. We heard about the Northern Education Group, which is so important, and again, that we never forget what happened and are able to hopefully learn from it. In connection with the group, please allow me to mention Ernie Hunter, also a member of Shari Hayim, Judith Heyman and Sean Asbridge for their involvement. I understand that some 8 schools will hear Tommy's address, which hopefully they will in turn will pass on to others. Cantor Michael Isdale from the Bowden Synagogue gave us his usual very emotive rendition of El Melech HaRahamim. I understand that there are many people involved in making this evening's presentation a success. Chris Spree and Sophie for successfully managing the technical side of things, the personal donors who so generously donated, and those who hopefully will donate to tonight's presentation, along with the Llandudno Town Council and Shari Hayim Synagogue, so that local schools can benefit. And last, but by no means least, to Roy Thurley and Jackie for their part in putting all this together. Roy, please accept the thanks of all those that will benefit from tonight in various ways. Hopefully next year we'll be back to normal. We'll all can enjoy the Llandudno air along with the 2023 presentation. So once again, a big thank you to all those people who have taken part, as well as you out there watching over Zoom. May God bless you all. Shalom and Nostar.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for those words. I also want to thank particularly those behind the scenes who have made this possible. This would not have happened so smoothly without the expertise of Chris Spree, who has managed the whole event from a computer in his home, with technical assistance also from his daughter Sophie in the West Midlands. As is our custom, we shall now sing the national anthems. We begin with the British national anthem, recognising obviously that this commemoration is being viewed in many parts of the United Kingdom and possibly also abroad. And then this will be followed by the Israeli national anthem, Hatikva. And I encourage you to sing along with us if you can. The words will appear on the screen.
God save our gracious Queen, long live our noble Queen. God save the Queen. Stand her victorious,
Thank you for joining us on Zoom this evening. We would normally take up a retiring offering at the end of our in-person meeting. So instead of that, I will leave you with a screen showing you how you can contribute to the work of the Northern Holocaust Education Group. I want to thank all those who've taken part and made this online event happen. I am still amazed at the technology which has allowed us all to come together from various places and maybe even some others around the world to share in this evening's act of remembrance. It is so important that we never forget the inhumanity of man that allowed the Holocaust to happen. I also want to thank Llandudno Town Council, who financially support this event every year, and Sha'arei Chaim congregation for their considerable help also. And now, thank you for joining us. Good night and God bless.